For over 50 years, the Nobel Conference at Gustavus Adolphus College has hosted preeminent scientists, theologians, and ethicists to discuss questions at the intersection of science and society. From the newest results in physics, chemistry, and biology to the newest fields of multidisciplinary study, scientists at the Nobel Conference have examined the universe at its largest and smallest scales, explored the oceans, described new materials, and investigated human and animal behavior. Conference speakers have debated the mechanisms of aging as well as the science and economics of food. Often, speakers have given us a glimpse of the next defining questions and how they might be answered. Throughout all of the conversations, ethicists and theologians have grounded the science in a human dimension. This year's conference focuses on addiction, a uniquely human condition. The 51st Nobel Conference, Addiction, Exploring the Science and Experience of an Equal Opportunity Condition, brings together experts in medicine, neuroscience, sociology, and philosophy to explore the science and experience of addiction. The conference explores a range of questions. What does it mean to be addicted? Is it a brain condition, a psychological disorder, a sociological problem? The answers to these questions raise a very important one. What treatment options are available? We hope you enjoy this year's presentation by Owen Flanagan entitled Willing Addicts, Drinkers, Dandies, Druggies, and Other Dionysians. Owen Flanagan is the James B. Duke Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Neurobiology at Duke University. He has done work in philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of social science, ethics, contemporary ethical theory, moral psychology, as well as on Buddhist and Hindu conceptions of the self. On the topic of addiction, Dr. Flanagan has proposed the twin normative failure model and explored the phenomenology of living with addiction.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is a wonderful, wonderful event. And I especially thank Lisa, who's been one of my handlers, but really my true and best and superior handlers are Jacqueline Parrish and Matt, whose name I don't know, but we're on a first name basis. Anyway, all three have been just wonderful. And I appreciate the hospitality of everyone here. I, in fact, just got the news this morning that one of my colleagues at Duke in the chemistry department won the Nobel Prize in chemistry today, so I feel like I'm at... It's a very special experience. So today, as you know, it's important for me to say this again, although I've been saying it. I'm a philosopher of mind. I work also in ethics, and I'm one of those substance abusers at the severe end we heard earlier today. In my case, I was addicted to both alcohol and prescription drugs, actually. So in both cases, I was doing perfectly legal things, as it were, but my life was in tatters. I'm not going to talk today. You can read about it in the paper, What It's Like to Be an Addict, about my own experience. But I will talk about addiction, and we've been trying to sort of focus in on what addiction is. As it's come out in our conversations, the word addiction now in the new DSMs only occurs actually in one case, I believe. It's in the case of gambling, and it's referred to as addiction in the text. They may want to pull that out next time. So the word addiction is being used less and less in scientific contexts, although it's not going away. So I'm going to use it in something like a conventional sense and see where we get. I have 6 slides. They're all pictures of people. There's no text on them. And my talk has 5 sections. The second section is the biggest. I'll tell you where I am, and then you'll know when I'm getting close to the end. It's easy to understand how one might become an alcoholic or an addict unwittingly. One drinks or uses drugs for fun, for novel experiences, to relax, to ease the pain, and then one gets hooked. It is puzzling to imagine someone becoming an addict on purpose, and it is puzzling in a different way to imagine someone who finds himself in the grip due to inadvertence or because he thought that this was what he wanted, continuing to think it is what he wants after he has experienced full-on addiction. It is natural to think that addiction is bad, feels bad, harms the body, the mind, as well as one's relations, family, love, work, and thus that it is never choice-worthy. If there are people who rationally choose addiction, either to become one or once becoming one to stay one, they are what I'm going to call tonight willing addicts. It's today. A willing addict prefers, all things considered, to be an addict. He has a settled disposition to continue to use in the way he uses. He endorses using the way he uses. Willing addicts, if there are any, are contrasted with two more familiar types of addicts. Unwilling addicts are individuals who want to quit, try to quit, but so far fail. So most addicts I know were once unwilling addicts. They were trying, and I'm a case like this too, to stop for a very, very long time, but they couldn't find their way out. So that's one kind, unwilling addicts. Resigned addicts are former unwilling addicts. They are demoralized. They have given up trying to quit. Willing addicts are unfamiliar, but I claim they're out there and have lessons to teach us about the nature of addiction. Really what I should say is the holistic nature of addiction and the very complex but very real attractions of living in zones of mind alteration. In today's talk, I discuss the reasons some addicts choose addiction, mostly to stay in addiction rather than to become an addict, rather than in recovery. I explore a set of cases that cluster around loving mind-altering experiences and the things, alcohol and other drugs that produce them, as well as possibly loving a certain lifestyle that involves using and drug-altered experiences. The inquiry for today has implications for our views about whether addiction is always a disorder and whether it is a physical, mental, or moral disorder, or all of these. My aim is mostly to assist in the project of thinking of addiction as a complex relational lifestyle phenomenon that is social and spectral. There is something wrong with the picture that sees addiction as an individual problem where the brain, or as a problem of the brain, where the brain has crossed a threshold between using normally and using abnormally or abusing, between non-addictive and addictive use. Things are much more complicated than this and involve a variety of person-level attitudes, regimens, and choice patterns, as well as social attitudes and permissions. Many addicts, willing, unwilling, and resigned, play with dosing and with types and mixtures of booze, prescription drugs, and illegal drugs. I was actually using drugs and alcohol together for a very long time, and we've heard about that. It has problems. I always said that on the prescription drugs, I was in 50% compliance because I didn't drive farm machinery. Rako and Garriott describe a program in Baltimore where many addicts creatively mix heroin, which is illegal, with Suboxone, a prescription drug that helps moderate the effects of opiates, and OxyContin, a prescription opiate, which they could technically but usually do not acquire through normal medical channels. I do not think most addicts are willing addicts or that willing addicts choose to use only for pleasure. Most addicts are unwilling or resigned. So I just point that out. In talking about this type of addiction tonight, I'm trying to help us understand addiction better. I'm not arguing that these are the most common. People willingly engage in all sorts of activities, including addictive use of alcohol and many drugs for reasons other than pleasure. For example, tuning up or down one's personality traits, taming physical pain or painful emotions, having novel experiences or meaningful experiences, and to enable smooth social relations and for reasons of group solidarity. That's section 1. Section 2, 6 examples of willing addicts. I'm only going to give you 5 of these. Morphine Mary. Some of these are made-up cases. And you'll notice a certain property of all my examples, but I won't tell you what it is. It's related to some talks that we've been hearing so far. Morphine Mary. Here's the situation. Imagine an elderly woman, Mary, who is given 6 months to live and is put on morphine to control pain and allow her to be present to herself and her loved ones as she dies. She, or her family, asks if this means she will become addicted. Suppose the hospice doctor is a geriatric oncologist who knows about and cares about the latest in the medical literature on addiction. The tandem is extremely unlikely. The doctor explains that recent DSMs do not contain an entry for addiction. Ordinary concepts like addiction and alcoholism, even though they are still used every day in every way by doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and ordinary people, are replaced in DSM-4 by the terms substance abuse and substance dependence, where the first relates to harm or impairment and the second to physical dependence, determined by such things as negative effects of coming off without a titration regimen, as well as a host of familiar behaviors, such as inordinate amount of time using, reduction of other meaningful activities in order to use, and so on. The hospice doctor tells Mary truthfully that she will become physically dependent on the morphine, and thus implies, without saying so explicitly, that she will have substance dependency in that sense. DSM requires at least 3 of its 7 characteristics or symptoms for a diagnosis of the bad kind of substance abuse dependence, and Mary will suffer only one, brain dependence, and that one would reveal itself only if she were to stop receiving morphine abruptly. If the hospice doctor knows about it and is impressed by DSM-5, she can say some even more consoling things. The twin diagnoses of substance abuse and substance dependency are replaced with a unified category, substance use disorder. And thus, since Mary will be under an expertly administered medical regimen, there will be no disorder. She is not scoring, that is, abusing street drugs. The regimen will ease the pain, help with normal sleep. It will enable cognitive alertness so that she can read, watch movies, enjoy music, and spend quality time with loved ones until the end. Of course, there will be a physical dependency in the sense that if there is a miracle and her terminal illness evaporates, she will need to be stepped down slowly. Otherwise, there would be major jonesing, which the doctor calls withdrawal symptoms. But of course, that is not really in the cards. Thus reassured, Mary says, fine. I say Mary is a willing addict. In 2 ways. She chooses to become addicted to morphine in one perfectly legitimate sense of addicted. She succeeds and wants things to stay this way until she dies. Others might say that Mary is willing but not an addict, or that she is an addict but it doesn't matter. I agree with this last. In both these cases, it is an extrinsic feature of Mary's situation that is key. If she isn't an addict, the key seems to be the way the morphine is administered and the reasons it is administered. We should assume, after all, that Mary's brain will come to crave morphine and be marked by morphine dependency in all the same ways as the brain of an individual who comes to be addicted after major surgery or who scores morphine on the street does. Anyone who thinks that addiction is a brain disease or disorder will need to say that Mary is an addict. Now, you've been part of this discussion for 2 days, and I think that's a fairly clear counterexample to the idea that you could define addiction or would want to define addiction in terms of a brain disease. The same situation applies if we say Mary is an addict, but it doesn't matter in the sense that we are not going to judge her as such. Here it is nothing about the morphine or what goes on in Mary's brain morphine-wise that makes it a case that doesn't matter. It is the goal of using the drug that takes it out of the domain of the normatively disapproved addictions. The word addict is public domain. Even if DSM-5 doesn't use the term, addiction or alcoholic are not going away. And in itself, this is not a big problem. In all the ordinary senses or usages of terms like addict, addiction, and their suite, Mary has decided to enter a regimen of drug use that will lead to pain relief, help with patterns of sleep, and so on. So she's a willing addict, but perhaps indeed probably she is not an individual with DSM-5 substance use disorder. Why not? Again, the answer is not entirely about Mary, since she is choosing to take an addictive drug and to become physically dependent on it, and were her doses to become unavailable, she would crave big time, and were she tried to come off quickly, she would experience all the symptoms of opiate withdrawal. The fact that she chooses addiction for a good reason, a really good set of reasons, doesn't change that. The fact that her relation with her drug of choice is well regulated is a feature of the institutions of medicine, the FDA, the law, not about morphine Mary's brain. Second example. Keith Richards, the lead guitarist of the Rolling Stones, is a different kind of case. In his autobiography, Life, and many interviews, Richards confirms that he was a longtime heroin user, plus most other things. Nowadays, Richards sticks mostly to red wine and pot, which he uses regularly. In one interview, I saw, they asked him how much is regularly. He said, all the time. Being the lead guitarist in the Rolling Stones makes it fairly easy to get well-controlled, high-grade heroin. If one is willing to pay enough, one can receive the drug cartel equivalent of FDA-approved safe doses of junk. Richard's goals in using heroin are not like Mary's. He was an experimentalist looking for fun, novelty, and creative sources. I've got to confess, I was very interested in what I could take and what I could do. I looked upon the body as a laboratory. I used to throw in this chemical and then that one to see what would happen. I was intrigued by that. He adds, it's like what Churchill said about alcohol. Believe me, I've taken a lot more out of alcohol than it's ever taken out of me. And I feel the same way about dope and stuff. I got something out of it. Imagine that based upon full information, we were to discover that Richard's brain lights up, or used to light up, in exactly the way the hijacked brain of an addict ought to light up. That is, by people who think that addiction is just a brain disease. So then he'd be an addict in one sense. But one might also think that the concept of addict doesn't apply, or what is different shouldn't be used. The normal rules don't apply. In Morphine Mary's case, it is weird to talk about addiction because the goals, pain relief, of her getting addicted to morphine, and she's dying. In Keith Richards' case, well, the normal rules don't apply either. After all, he's a fucking Rolling Stone. And thus he is not involved directly. He has agents who do the dirty work of procuring his drugs at a very high organized crime level, is getting pharmaceutical-grade heroin, or top-of-the-line drugs, or whatever sort he wants. Not in the seamy life of getting God knows what grade heroin on the street like normal addicts do. If Keith Richard is or was an addict, he is a willing one. Here's a different kind of case. In the tragic comedy movie Drugstore Cowboy, based on the true-to-life book by James Fogle with the same name, Bob Hughes, the junkie protagonist, ends up in a halfway house where he steps down from a regimen of any mind-altering substance he can get his hands on, to a culturally acceptable state-administered methadone maintenance program. At this point in the film, Bob no longer robs drugstores and hospital pharmacies to fuel himself and his elected family of fellow junkies. That's the whole family. That's Bob in the front. At this point in the film, he no longer robs, I'll repeat, drugstores and hospital pharmacies to fuel himself and his elected family of fellow junkies. He ran into, quote, bad luck, when Nadine, a member of his merry band of jacked up folk, died from an overdose. That's Nadine in the back. And he had it. Bob's girlfriend, Diane, doesn't see the death of Nadine as the same type of bad luck that Bob does. That is, as reason to go on the wagon, or what is different, to change their felonious method of drug acquisition to a state-sponsored kind of addiction. Diane visits Bob in his halfway house, and Bob suggests she join him there in recovery. But Bob's new lifestyle is a non-starter for Diane. She loves dope and is still unreservedly committed to the whole lifestyle, and seems not to comprehend why Bob is doing what he is doing. In fact, she is already the old lady of Nadine's junkie widower, Rick, formerly Bob's sycophantic underling. As a parting gesture of abiding affection, Diane gifts Bob a satchel filled with a potpourri of drugs. But Bob, now committed to a methadone regimen, passes his bounty on to Father Joe, an elderly Catholic priest who he has known since childhood and still an active dope fiend. Father Joe, who thinks Bob ought to be a philosopher for his vaguely depressive existential pronouncements, judges Bob worthy of divine indulgences for sharing his bounty. Bob sums up his situation at this point: I'm a junkie, I love drugs, I love the whole lifestyle, it just didn't work out so well. Bob Hughes, the drugstore cowboy, is a case of someone who chooses to be an addict as part of a whole lifestyle, or maybe choosing isn't the right word, maybe staying in addiction at a certain point. He chooses as a part of a whole lifestyle. Bob is a big loser from the reader or viewer's perspective, but it is not clear that he is a loser from his own perspective. He is a junkie who loves drugs and the lifestyle. Things didn't work out, so he made some sort of all things considered adjustment. Of course, he is not off dope. He is now a methadone addict, or more politely, he is physically dependent on methadone. Next example. Drinkers who are not yet piss artists. Drinkers differ from junkies. That's a technical term for me, drinkers. Drinkers differ from junkies both in terms of their drug of choice as well as typically in terms of gender, social class, country of origin, and the execution of their habit. Like Keith Richards, drinkers have a certain impunity from severe social criticism. But whereas Richards' impunity from normal categorization comes from being a rock and roll god and super rich, the category of drinkers are recipients of a certain social permission to be as they are for quirky historical reasons. Drinkers, again, might fit the typical brain profile of an alcoholic perfectly well, but they are willing participants in their own alcoholism. They have no trouble negotiating the relevant lifestyle, or not too much trouble negotiating the relevant lifestyle, since liquor is legal and affordable for them. For them, but not for everyone who uses as they do, there are structures in place, often audience permissions, even appreciation to use to excess. There are jobs that cooperate, no partners or partners who are okay with things. Being male, being English, and working in a creative profession provide the context for this class of willing addict. Christopher Hitchens was a drinker. In Hitch 22, a memoir, he writes, "Alcohol for me," and this is Christopher Hitchens, it's probably 10 years before he died, and you'll see the setup matters here. He says this, "Alcohol for me has been an aspect of my optimism. The mood caught by Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited when he discourses on aspects of the Bacchic and the Dionysian and claims that he at least chooses to drink in the love of the moment and the wish to prolong and enhance it. I dare say that some people have seen me the worse for wear in less charming ways, but I know that I have been true to the original as well. The commander, his father, was not a happy drinker. He didn't actually drink all that much, but he imbibed regularly and determinedly. And it was reinforcement to his pessimism and the disappointment, both personal and political." End quote. His father's attitude towards gin was, we are told, a relatively devout one. Later in the memoir, in a hilarious half-dozen pages entitled, quote, "A Short Footnote on the Grape and the Grain," Hitch takes up the widespread view that he is a drinker, a prodigious drinker. He does not deny this. But he says in his endearing and modest way that his writing and public speaking regimen would have been impossible were he what, quote, the English so bluntly call a piss artist. Hitchens is well aware that piss artistry is the, quote, professional deformation of many writers and has ruined not a few. I remember Kingless Amesley, no slouch, saying that he could tell on what page of the novel Paul Scott had reached for the bottle and thrown caution to the wind. Hitch then explains, and you'll see this scene depicted, "I work at home, where indeed there is a barroom, and can suit myself, but I don't. At about midday, a decent slug of Mr. Walker's Amber Restorative, cut with Perrier water, an ideal delivery system, and no ice. At luncheon, perhaps a half bottle of red wine, not always more, but never less. Then back to the desk and ready to repeat the treatment at the evening meal. No after-dinner drinks, most especially nothing sweet and never, ever any brandy. Nightcaps, depending on how well the day went, but always the mixture as before. No mixing, no messing around with gin here and vodka there. Alcohol can make other people less tedious and food less bland, and can help provide what the Greeks called entheos, or the slight buzz of inspiration when reading or writing." A bit later he writes, "Hitch, making rules about drinking can be a sign of an alcoholic, as Martin Amis once teasingly said to me. Of course, watching the clock for the start time is probably a bad sign. But here are some simple pieces of advice for the young. Don't drink on an empty stomach. The main point of the refreshment is the enhancement of food. Don't drink if you have the blues. It's a junk cure. Drink when you're in a good mood. Cheap booze is a false economy. It's not true that you shouldn't drink alone. These can be the happiest glasses you ever drain. Hangovers are another bad sign. Avoid oral narcotics. These make you more boring rather than less so, and are not designed, as are the grape and the grain, to enliven company. End quote. I admit that in the Hitchens case is indeterminate across a host of dimensions that make it hard to know whether he counts as an alcoholic or not. He drinks a lot, loves drinking, loves the effects, and has a wife that's okay with it. Friends of his, I know some, wondered and worry about his prodigious drinking, his prodigious capacity. If the brain and the body develop various kinds of dependency through regular use, his brain and body have those kind of dependencies. But he is entirely on board with his drinking. The next example, I'm not going to do both of these examples. This next example is another English writer. This is the last of the second section, Drinking in Mecca. Lawrence Osborne, Osborne's The Wet and the Dry, is another testimonial by a drinker. Osborne is not quite a perfect example of a willing addict, but he is not unwilling or resigned either. Remember, an unwilling addict is someone who's really trying to stop but can't find her way out. A resigned addict is someone who's thrown in the towel. So he's not a perfect example of those. And he is, by his own standards, alcoholic. An experienced and distinguished travel writer, he decides on a journey to the Middle East to see if non-drinking Muslims have anything to teach, and wonders ambivalently about whether the new social atmospherics and laws against drinking might change his behavior. They don't. Osborne is, as he calls himself, a visiting alcoholic, and insinuates at one point that he is America's greatest vodka critic. He is, as drinkers tend to be, English, but has lived in New York City for a long time. It encourages Osborne when he comes upon an ancient Dionysian temple in Lebanon and reminds himself Dionysianism was the most popular religion before the arrival of Christianity and eventually Islam. He gets that drinking has its downside. There are hangovers, the blackouts, and the bad behavior. But he contrasts his kind of distinctively posh English drinking with morbid and escapist drinking. The Irish, quote, "The Irish, I am bound to admit, have a particular penchant for this relation between intoxication and morbidity. I have absolutely no penchant." Edgar Allan Poe once wrote, quote, in the stimulants in which I sometimes so madly indulge, it has not been in the pursuit of pleasure that I apparel life and reputation and reason. It has been the desperate attempt to escape from torturing memories, from a sense of insupportable loneliness and a dread of some strange impending doom. Osborne says that the Plains Indians of the 19th century became addicted without an Irish psyche, but drink destabilized them, like they did for my people, and, quote, destabilized them into madness, into altered states of melancholic strangeness, and ultimately, of course, destroyed them, end quote. But Osborne is upbeat, at least as far as his personal situation goes. The drinker, he writes, quote, is a self-critic, a connoisseur of his own altered states. He knows exactly how to tweak them upwards or downwards. He is an amateur alchemist when it comes to the drinks themselves. If he is a writer and wanted to explain himself to strangers, he would write a book called In Praise of Intoxication. No one would invite him to explain his views in public. One might think here of great British actors like Richard Harris, Peter O'Toole, and Richard Burton. Were they perhaps posh Bob Hugheses? Harris and O'Toole eventually went on the wagon when things didn't work out. But they never denied that they loved it while it lasted. Were they willing addicts while it lasted? Probably. Burton died young, probably related to his alcoholism. Was he a willing addict to the end? Maybe. Osborne explains how English culture allows willing addiction among people of certain means and social class. Quote, the English are very indulgent to episodes of alcoholic insanity. They strike them as sympathetic, understandable, and a sign of being a real human being, end quote. Quote again, the English relationship to drink is so deeply burned into my way of being in the world that to write about drink is to simultaneously write about England, a country I know almost nothing about since I've lived in New York close to 20 years. Later he writes, quote, "The drinker's legendary unhappiness and frustration are often exaggerated. The daily intoxication arises from an entire life's experience, not from an illness that is supposed to be less mysterious." Osborne is mostly able to regulate his drinking and has a certain sympathy for both himself and the lifestyle of the English drinker. He is certainly not a resigned alcoholic. Is he still drinking? If he is still drinking, he fits the willing addict profile, or at least he is, as they say, on the spectrum. Now, I'm not going to read about my last example, but if you're tempted to look up another case of this, this is Matthew McConaughey in True Detective Season 1. I have a whole section in the paper where I could talk about him as another good example of someone who is not a resigned addict, but he's still committed to a certain, what he would acknowledge as an alcoholic lifestyle. Okay, so I'm going to skip over that example just so you're starting probably to notice certain properties that these individuals have in common. Okay, so now we go to the shorter sections, 3 short sections. 3, social and cultural permissions. There is evidence from what I've said so far that there are various kinds of cultural and economic variation, as well as differences in individual psychology, that allow willing addiction or an addictive lifestyle without the normal costs that lead to social and self-stigmatization. Being English, I used to say being English, being rich, being an artist, and being male look like features of a culture that lower the threshold for getting fussy about addiction, alcoholism, and substance abuse disorders, as well as for the addict not experiencing the familiar kinds of shame, depression, embarrassment, loss of jobs, loved ones, legal problems that many addicts suffer. One kind of consider artistic permission. Kay Redfield Jamison, in her book Touched with Fire, Manic Depressive Illness and the Artistic Temperament, devotes the book to exploring the fact that, quote, "Writers and artists show a vastly disproportionate rate of manic depressive or depressive illness." She claims that all the following fit the bill: Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Keats, Schumann, Tennyson, Van Gogh, Poe, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Melville, Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Delmore Schwartz, John Berryman, Graham Greene, John Cheever, and William Styron. There's also this link, which is important for present purposes. There are elevated rates of alcohol and drug abuse among populations with bipolar disorder. 60%, this is Kay Redfield Jamison, says she's a psychologist. 60% have a history of some kind of substance abuse or dependence. Quote, "Conversely, there is a significantly higher percentage of bipolar patients in populations of alcoholics and drug abusers." End quote. How are we to explain this apparent link between creativity, bipolar disorder, and addiction? One hypothesis that I am fond of is that creative genius is best understood as a property of individuals, is best understood not as a property of individuals, they are geniuses, a gift such individuals have and others do not have in themselves, in their psyches, but rather genius is a relational property that is partly constituted by the audience response to the artist's expression. Artistic expression, especially well-received artistic expression, makes or allows the audience to see better what is there. Think the French Impressionists. Or to go beyond some conventional boundary to what is different, tantalizing, interesting. Think Stravinsky and Schumann. So one idea is that bipolar people have unusual experiences more than most. They are less inhibited than non-bipolar people about expressing these unusual experiences. In manic phases, they have more energy to sustain these unusual expressions. Then high rates of alcohol and drug abuse are explained by the triad of desires to self-medicate, the disinhibition that partly constitutes mania, and by social encouragement for their creative expressions, which can be or can be thought by them and by us to be enhanced by drugs and or alcohol. Obviously, most alcoholics are not bipolar, but the percentage of people with bipolar disorder who are also alcoholics is, as you heard, high. Rainbow addicts, unwilling, resigned to willing. The final example is not about posh folks or creative artists who have various kinds of means and permissions to be willing addicts, but involves people who are not posh at all. And about these, I have a question whether they should be better conceived as resigned or unwilling, but this is related to discussions we had earlier about harm mitigation. So it seems to me, but they involve people who are not posh at all. They are, these so-called rainbow addicts, it seems to me, recipients of a kind of compassionate social policy that allows them a chance to move from being ashamed, unwilling, or resigned addicts to something closer to a willing addict who's helped to find a way to be an addict and live in a manner that is acceptable both subjectively and by the lights of the wider community. The Rainbow Group is an NGO in Amsterdam, committed to helping people with such problems as homelessness, psychiatric illnesses, drug use and alcoholism. One program they run in Amsterdam involves drinkers who are paid a salary and a beer stipend to pick up trash. This is one of many techniques practiced across the world that involve contingency management, where the contingencies that are managed by the addicts as well as by communal, legal, and political institutions. The workday begins, as it often did in colonial times at many workplaces in the northeast of the United States, with the workers being offered, and they always accept, 2 pints of beer. There are 2 more at lunch, and then 2 more at closing time. 6 pints of beer spread throughout the workday. The workers are also paid a salary of 10 euros a day, half a pack of rolling tobacco, and a free lunch. 10 euros would be about $13. This is more or less the alcoholic equivalent of a methadone maintenance program, but with work required. Workers call beer their medicine. Some report continuing the slow drip method of drinking after work, but also feeling renewed self-esteem and self-respect. Once these men were, and would self-describe as alcoholics, losers, drinkers, piss artists, drunks, and chronic relapsers. They once were unwilling addicts, trying and failing to stop, or resigned addicts, feeling hopeless, demoralized, and no longer trying to stop. Now, one can imagine that they, like people on methadone maintenance programs, feel like the term alcoholic or addict doesn't apply, or doesn't quite apply. If this is right, then what is different in these alcoholics is not that their brains don't light up in the way alcoholic brains allegedly light up, or that they would not experience the phenomenology of craving were they not to get dosed properly, but something about their attitude and that of at least some others towards their using. The alcoholics accept, even embrace, that they are alcoholic. They accept a regimen of partial moderation, really maintenance dosing, but only during work hours, and they are able to make a living wage doing something socially useful. This enhances self-esteem and self-respect. I said earlier that resigned addicts are typically former unwilling addicts. They have tried to quit, often with utmost sincerity and great effort, but failed again and again. Eventually, they give up trying to quit. The Rainbow Group alcoholics might fit the bill of willing addicts who were formerly unwilling addicts, and then again, after that, hopeless resigned addicts. It's hard to know if this is the best way to describe them and the situation. But something, actually several things, individual and social, have improved. The phenomenon is holistic. It takes particular individuals in a particular culture or ecology with a certain set of attitudes, compassion, harm reduction, a certain set of permissions, drink, and demands, but work, and an NGO that is able to implement a practical program. And I should add, of course, in a political state that allows all this to happen. Would it be best to manage contingencies so that willing addiction was more of a live option than it is now, by making addiction less costly to addicts, by, for example, changing the monetary cost and legal status of drugs, and by promoting programs like Rainbow Group's Dutch experiment? I think so. Doing so would not mean full-on advocacy of alcoholism or drug addiction as an excellent way of living, a good option for most people. Even if we in liberal societies decide to provide space for some addicts to be both with their addiction willingly and of service to the community, there would still be all the remaining normative space for friends, family, employers to make clear to even willing alcoholics and addicts that there will be prices to pay for choosing booze and drugs. Furthermore, for many, possibly most alcoholics and addicts, drinking and drugging will eventually stop doing for them whatever it once did for them. Instead, it will do something else. There will be psychic hell to pay, and the alcoholic or addict will want to stop. Luckily, where there is a will, there is usually a way. quick fourth section. Is addiction a brain disorder? What about the idea that addiction is ultimately a brain disease? That a common neurological disorder binds all addicts, or even addicts in a group? You might say each kind of alcoholic has a different brain, each kind of substance abuser has a different brain profile. What about that idea that it's a brain disease? That a common neurological disorder binds all addicts and is what ails them? One could in principle hold the view that addiction is a brain disease and also accept my argument that there are some addicts who are willing. The view would be that there's a spectrum of addiction types that includes willing addicts, unwilling addicts, and resigned addicts, and former addicts too, who will suppose remain highly vulnerable. You heard a lot about relapse yesterday. And some people think of, well, I won't go there. Maybe in question. What makes them all addicts is the brain disease. Okay, this would be the brain disease hypothesis, which in the case of former addicts, I guess, is in remission. While it is true that the view that addiction is a brain disease is compatible with my argument that addiction comes in varieties, including the variety of willing addiction, I resist the idea that addiction is a brain disease. I claimed at the beginning that an addict is a person, and addiction is a lifestyle. So I prefer that addiction does not turn out to be a brain disease because, well, a brain state, even a complex, dynamic, temporally extended brain state, is not a lifestyle. Consider this. In Alcoholics Anonymous and in Narcotics Anonymous, one hears that most everyone has some success in stopping, but most had trouble staying stopped. We sometimes say, this is colloquial, the off switch is broken or works erratically. This is not a bad metaphor. The idea that alcoholism, as well as other kinds of substance addiction, involves a brain component, and thus that certain aspects or features of alcoholism, again, I'm using this to be at the strong end of the spectrum, the severe end, involves a brain component, and thus that certain aspects or features of alcoholism and perhaps addiction generally are in the brain, can be useful here. It is worth noting that AA says that alcoholism is a disease, although interestingly, the Alcoholics Anonymous view is that alcoholism is a disease of the body, mind, and spirit, which I take it to be closer to the lifestyle view than the brain view. Regarding the brain, there are nowadays drugs that reduce the reinforcing effects of using drugs or alcohol. There are drugs that will make you sick if you use. There are drugs that reduce anxiety and depression, which, depending on the alcoholic, make her vulnerable to relapse. There are drugs for bipolar addicts, who are most vulnerable to relapse during manic phases, and so on. Are these drugs treating a brain disease? And if so, which one? The self-esteem one? The depression one? The mania one? The anxiety one? The stress one? The off-switch one? In my experience, it is almost always the off-switch one that those who believe that addiction is a brain disorder will say is the problem, and that needs to be treated, fixed, circumvented, worked around, or rewired. To be sure, the off-switch problem might be the major obstacle to doing what one wishes, assuming one is an unwilling addict, once deep in addiction, namely quitting. But the off-switch problem, is not the disease or condition of addiction. If there is an off-switch problem, and maybe there commonly is, it is the major source of difficulty in achieving the wish to stop. It is a major obstacle in the addict's way as they try to stop using. But the off-switch problem, is not their alcoholism, not what their addiction is, and certainly not even where it is. An off-switch problem metaphorically names some set of actual problems in, we'll suppose, the midbrain with the dopaminergic system, the decoupling of the wanting and liking systems. I want and need what I no longer overall like. Or the problem at the neural level that disables or blocks successfully executing instructions to self like, this is no longer going well, cease and desist. It is possible, I think it is likely, that several aspects or features of addiction are literally in the brain, some aspects. The pathways that quickly reactivate craving after relapse in alcoholics are likely largely in the brain. And most saliently, the compromised system that creates the seemingly insurmountable problems in exerting willpower are almost certainly partly in the brain. An addict, however, like everyone else, is a fully embodied being in the world. And every perception, mood, emotion, thought, and action involves their particular nervous system. But addiction is no more in the brain than walking or being married or having a job is in the brain. Still, one can sometimes effectively leverage or reorient or help the addict manage to do what they wish, stop, by leveraging some particular neural pathway. This is a practical psychobiological fact and has no ontological implications as far as what addiction is or where it is. None. Suppose one says, okay, maybe addiction is not in the brain, but surely its cause is in the brain. There is this reply. There are almost no monocauses in the world for anything. And thus speaking of the cause of anything is almost always practical shorthand, not metaphysically or scientifically precise. Becoming alcoholic or a drug addict requires using over a lot of time. The vodka, the heroin, or the cocaine are causes, as are the histories and schedules of use. Genes make causal contributions. Depending on the addict, idiosyncratic features, shyness, gregariousness, low or high self-esteem, depression or mania, being alone or with others, low stress or high stress, being happy or sad, or a personality disorder make contributions. Eventually, the drinks or the drugs affect the off switches in many addicts' brains, so that even if they want to stop, they have trouble. This true and erratic or broken off switch is a causal contributor, but no single causal contributor is the cause. So addiction is not a brain disease, nor is the cause in the brain. This is Logic 101, Neuroscience 101 too. That said, addicts have brains, and the brains of addicts are one of the many features of the world that can be leveraged in treating addiction. These include features of the socioeconomic surround, culture and cultural history, the ends or goals of drug users, and the norms and practices of communal, legal, medical, and therapeutic institutions. We live at a time of the ascendancy of neurospeak, so it matters that in the rush to find brain markers for certain kinds of addiction and substance abuse, we do not lose sight of other features of these complex phenomena. Note finally, to emphasize the point that I have not said that addiction is not an affliction or a disorder, or even a disease, maybe. I think it usually is a subject, I know it is usually subject to such normative assessments, including in the typical case from the perspective of the drinker or some drinkers or users themselves, but not always, as in the case of willing addiction. I've denied that the affliction, disease, or disorder is best conceived as a brain affliction, disease, or disorder. It isn't, although some aspects of addiction, especially late-stage compulsivity, is likely due to neural systems that create major obstacles in reasserting self-control. Conclusion, just another page. Conclusion. In Addiction Trajectories, it's a 2013 book by anthropologists, Eugene Rakel and William Garriott, leaders in the field of the anthropology of addiction, write that thinking and speaking about addiction runs along three trajectories. One, epistemic trajectories traced by categories and concepts of addiction as they change over time and move across institutional domains. Two, the therapeutic trajectories of treatments as they move through distinct cultural and organizational settings. And three, the experiential and experimental trajectories of lives constituted through the terrains of addiction and subjectivity. These three trajectories help explain how and why categories used to describe the phenomena, categories such as addiction, alcoholic, addict, brain disease, disorders of choice, interpersonal disorder, social problem, vary with treatment regimens, the variable statuses of the sciences or research programs that endorse them, the city or nation-state locations of users, the socioeconomic status of users and the ends of users, fun, pleasure, creativity, killing mental or physical pain, and ennui. This book reinforces to my mind the view that there is no natural kind that is addiction. It is at best a complex sociocultural kind. One can stipulate, as some do, that bona fide or real addiction to some substance has as its necessary and or sufficient conditions some brain profile, like the midbrain hijack, or some phenomenological profile, overwhelming desire to use, or something like shame, obsession, and craving, or some behavioral profile, a certain frequency or amount of use. Such stipulation might be useful for certain purposes, for example, creating priority lists for inpatient rehabilitation facilities, or making determinations about who will benefit from what kind of prescription drug, social work intervention, or psychological therapy. But the phenomenon of addiction in real-world ecologies is not so tame that it can be corralled by a measure across a single dimension. The phenomenon of willing addiction reminds us there are different ways even full-on addicts can respond to their addiction. including reflective endorsement of it. The conditions under which such endorsement or acceptance occurs are, to a point, matters of individual psychology or subjectivity, involving how much fun, pain relief, experiential novelty, and meaningful altered states provide and have for a particular addict. But willing addiction is not only an individual matter. It requires social cooperation, various permissions, interpersonal and legal, that allow an individual to be as they choose. Sometimes such permissions align in disturbing but not unfamiliar ways with money, lots, race, white, and gender, male. Should the impunities that allow for willing addiction be extended to all rather than only to some, and in ways that are not classist, racist, and sexist? Unless one thinks that abuse, dependency, and addiction are always and everywhere bad, then one ought to answer yes. The phenomenon of willing addiction makes visible modes of being an addict, or abuser, or dependent that involve, all things considered, endorsement by the addict, and which we, who are not ourselves willing addicts, can perhaps see as not an entirely awful lifestyle for them. Possibly in some cases, we could even see the appeal, the charm of using mind-altering drugs, not just for them, but for us. This much can help with sympathetic understanding. Willing addiction also helps us see ways that some of the many contingencies governing the way we think and treat addicts can be adjusted and modified. Many, perhaps most, addicts will eventually want their way out of active addiction. Increasingly, there are effective methods to help with this project of graduating to being a former addict or alcoholic in recovery. For individuals who cannot find a way to become former addicts, practices like those of the Rainbow Group allow some unwilling or resigned addicts to become willing, self-respecting addicts, which seems like a good thing. Thank you.